They say that if you stare into the forest long enough, it'll stare back. And few people know this better than Gerald Croft, who spent his life working in the woods. But when he looked into the trees one day, what he saw was something that sent chills down his spine. It was something that had never been there before, and would soon be a part of his life forever. Gerald was born and raised in a small town surrounded by thick woods. He grew up hearing stories about the forest from the locals, many of which claimed that it was cursed. As a young boy, he didn't believe them. But as he got older and learned more about the dangers lurking in the woods, his perspective changed. Even so, he still loved the forest and spent most of his free time hiking its many trails. One day, while walking through the woods, Gerald came across an old, weathered log. The sun was shining through the leaves, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the forest floor. Gerald sat down on the log and closed his eyes, breathing in the fresh air. But when he opened his eyes again, he noticed something strange. He could have sworn that just a moment ago there hadn't been anything there, but now it was like a dark shadow looming over him. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but as he watched, the shadow seemed to grow darker and more defined. It was the shape of a man, tall and thin, with long, sharp teeth. Gerald tried to ignore it at first, telling himself it was just a trick of the light or maybe a bear. But the longer he sat there, the more the shadow seemed to take shape. It was like something out of a nightmare, and Gerald couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over him. He stood up abruptly and started to walk away, but the further he went, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. Finally, he turned around and looked back at the log, and that's when he saw it. Standing there in the clearing was the man from the shadow, his eyes fixed on Gerald. Gerald froze in his tracks. He couldn't move or speak. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then the man took a step towards Gerald, and the forest seemed to sigh. Gerald finally found his voice. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. But the man didn't answer. He just kept staring at Gerald, his eyes boring into his soul. Then he took another step forward, and Gerald screamed and ran. He ran as fast as he could, crashing through the underbrush, not daring to look back. He could hear the man's footsteps behind him, heavy and slow, like the tread of a bear. He didn't know how long he ran for, but eventually he burst out of the trees and stumbled onto a logging road. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, his heart pounding in his chest. He got in the car and slammed the door shut, then started the engine and drove away as fast as he could. He didn't look back. He didn't dare look back. When he finally got home, he collapsed on the couch, shaking and sobbing. His wife, Mary, rushed to his side, her face etched with concern. She held him as he cried, trying to calm him down. But it took a long time for Gerald to finally relax. And when he finally told Mary what had happened, she didn't believe him. She thought he'd lost his mind. But Gerald insisted that what he'd seen was real. He described the man in detail, the way he'd been standing in the clearing, the darkness around him. But Mary just shook her head. "It's the stress," she said. "You've been working too hard. You need a break." But Gerald knew what he'd seen. He'd never forget those eyes, those dark, soulless eyes that seemed to stare right through him. In the days that followed, Gerald couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He'd walk down the street and feel a sudden chill, like the man from the forest was standing behind him. He'd turn around, of course, but there would be no one there. But he knew that wasn't true. He felt it in his bones. He tried to tell the police, but they didn't believe him either. They thought he was making it all up. So Gerald was left with no choice but to protect himself. He bought a shotgun and kept it by his bed, not daring to go into the woods anymore. But the strange things kept happening. Sometimes he'd hear footsteps outside his house in the middle of the night. Other times, he'd see dark shadows moving at the edge of his vision. And then there were the dreams. Every night he dreamed of the forest, of the clearing where he'd seen the man, of those dark, soulless eyes watching him. And every morning when he woke up, he'd feel the same dread and fear that had gripped him in the forest. One night, Gerald was awoken from a dream by a loud crash. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding, and listened intently. He heard it again, a loud crash followed by heavy footsteps. He grabbed his shotgun and crept towards the window. Peeking out into the darkness, he saw a dark figure moving in the yard. Adrenaline surged through Gerald and he raised the shotgun, aiming it at the figure. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice shaking. The figure stopped and turned towards him. And in the dim light of the moon, Gerald saw it was a man. For a moment, their eyes met through the window, and Gerald felt a jolt of recognition. It was the man from the forest. But how? How could he be here? Gerald knew he had to act fast. Pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast shattered the night, and the man screamed and fell to the ground. Gerald ran outside, his heart pounding, and found the man lying on the grass, his chest stained with blood. Gerald was shaking. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to call the police, but he knew they wouldn't believe him. As he stood there, the man slowly got to his feet. Blood was dripping down his chest, and his eyes were filled with pain and anger. He looked at Gerald and whispered, "You'll regret this." Out. And with that, he vanished into the darkness. Gerald was left standing there in the moonlight, his shotgun heavy in his hands. He didn't know what to do. What had he just shot, and where did he go? The forest was dark and silent now, and Gerald felt a sense of foreboding settle over him. He knew that this was just the beginning. The next morning, Gerald went to the spot where he'd found the man, but there was no sign of him. No blood, no footprints, nothing. It was like he'd never been there. Gerald called the police and told them what had happened, but they didn't believe him. They thought he was still losing his mind. So Gerald was left to deal with the aftermath alone. He couldn't sleep, eat, or concentrate. He felt like he was going crazy. And then the nightmares started. Every night, Gerald dreamed of the forest, of the man he'd shot. In his dreams, the man would appear, his eyes blazing with hatred, and whisper, "You'll pay for what you did." And then he would reach out and try to grab Gerald, his fingers like claws. One night, Gerald woke up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, drenched in sweat. He sat up in bed, his eyes wide, staring into the darkness. He could feel the presence of the man in the room with him, and he knew he had to get out of the house, to get away from the forest. He put on some clothes quickly and slipped out of the house. He didn't know where he was going, but he just needed to get away. He drove his car for hours, but the forest seemed to be everywhere. And he could feel the man's presence in the car with him, his hatred, his anger. Finally, exhausted and afraid, Gerald checked into a motel. He didn't sleep much that night, but he didn't care. He was just glad to be away from the forest, or so he thought. Because when he woke up in the morning, he found that the man had followed him. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes dark and menacing. Gerald screamed and tried to get away, but the man was faster. He grabbed Gerald by the throat and whispered, "You can't escape me. The forest took you once, and now it's taking you back." And with that, he dragged Gerald away. Gerald struggled, but it was no use. The man was too strong. He dragged Gerald through the forest deeper and deeper into its dark heart. Finally, they came to a clearing. And in the middle of the clearing was a large, gnarled tree. The man pushed Gerald towards the tree and whispered, "This is where it begins." Then he let go and stepped back, revealing the truth. The man was not a man at all. It was the tree. The tree had taken the form of the man to lure Gerald into the forest. And now it was reaching out its branches towards him, its leaves rustling like whispers in the wind. Gerald stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't want to go any further. But the tree seemed to sense his fear, and its branches reached out towards him, wrapping themselves around him like icy fingers. He screamed as he was pulled towards the tree, his body being crushed by its powerful branches. The last thing he saw was the forest floor rushing up to meet him, the leaves and dirt obscuring his vision, and then everything went black. The forest had claimed another victim. The tree swayed gently in the breeze, its branches heavy with the souls of those it had taken. And as the sun set, the forest grew dark, hiding its secrets deep within its shadowy depths.